Hi, my name is Chelsea Hastings, and this is my qualitative research presentation. Starting with the 9 characteristics of qualitative research, you have the participants' meanings, natural setting, researcher as key instrument, multiple sources of data, inductive and deductive data analysis, emergent design, reflexivity, researcher's role, and a complex account. And now I'll go into detail of each one of these. Starting with the participant's meaning, this characteristic is talking about how the researcher is solely focused on the participant's meaning of the issue or the problem. So the researcher is not focused on their own bias, their own perception, and they're not focused on previous literature. They are only looking to gain the data that the participant shares. And then talking about natural setting, this means that the data is collected at the site of the problem or the issue. So this means that the researcher normally goes to the participants rather than the participants going to the researcher. And this also discusses how the exposure and the observation usually occurs over a prolonged period of time instead of it just occurring at one place or time. It goes over a prolonged period of time. So a couple of examples could be, if talking about the participants' meaning, let's say that the issue is that a particular college campus has a large population of students failing classes. Well, the researcher would be solely focused on the participants, meaning the college or the students, and understanding what could be causing them to fail so many classes. And the natural setting would, of course, be on a college campus. The next characteristic would be the researcher as the key instrument. This means that the researcher could be an active participant or an observer, but the researcher plays a critical role in this type of research method. So the researcher is collecting and interpreting the data themselves. They don't typically use questionnaires or instruments developed by other researchers. And then when you're talking about multiple sources of data, this means that the data typically comes from several sources. Like it says, it's not just one source of data. The researcher is really gathering as many sources as they can to then understand, the themes and the codes that are associated with this problem or issue. And then this also, it gives the participants the space to share freely instead of having like specified questions in a survey that they have to answer. So, and a couple of examples of this would be like the researcher is observing and interviewing students while they're in different classes, if we're talking about the same examples we used in the previous characteristics of students failing classes on campus. The researcher would be interviewing the students while they're in different classes to gather information. And then the multiple sources of data. Maybe the researcher is, observing classes that the students are doing well in and classes that they aren't doing well in. They could be looking at tests, at the way they're structured, the way that they could be interviewing teachers. They could be looking at notes from students. There could be several sources of data that they're gathering information for this issue. Next, we're going to be talking about inductive and deductive data analysis. So starting with that, we're talking about how in the research, the researcher is trying to build patterns and categories and themes from the bottom up. So after they've gathered a bunch of data, they're then looking back through that and understanding what patterns are emerging and what themes are associated with those patterns. That's the inductive part. And then the deductive part is after they have some patterns and themes set, they're going back to the research to look at if there's more evidence to support those specific themes. This is a very back and forth process because maybe they go back and realize that some of the themes that they suggested doesn't have much more supporting evidence, but they realize that another theme is emerging. So maybe they consolidate some themes, maybe they, eliminate some, maybe they add some new ones. This can be a very back and forth process for the data analysis section. And then talking about emergent design, this means that the research method and the researcher need to be very malleable, and they need to allow the plan to evolve during the research. This means that, maybe they start going in one direction, but then as research and data presents itself, they need to pivot and move into a different direction because that's where the research is taking them. The main key is to learn about the problem or the issue from the participants. The researcher does not need to have tunnel vision or have a hypothesis that they are trying to prove. They need to allow the participants and the research that they've gathered from the participants to really shape the way that the research is showing itself. So some examples of the patterns, categories, and themes that could be noted from the college campus example I'm going with is that maybe, as they're gathering the data, they notice that a category could be that students are doing worse in classes where teachers use chalkboards versus where teachers use white erase boards for whatever reason. And then the emergent design process could be that, maybe in the beginning they were solely focused on the students' perspectives, but maybe the way that the teachers are teaching is having a bigger impact than they initially thought. So that they start to involve the teachers and kind of widen the scope to involve that person in that category as well. The next characteristics are reflexivity and the researcher's role. So talking about reflexivity, we're talking about the biases and the values and the personal background of the researcher. So their past experiences with the research or the problem should not become involved in their research currently. So for example, maybe the researcher had a really hard time in a certain class in college, and they are a little bit biased moving into this research because in their head they're saying, this class is hard, that's why students are failing. They need to be able to remove that bias and personal perspective as much as possible so that they can be open to really see what the research brings them. And then they also need to state their personal biases in the discussion or the findings page because the reader of the research needs to understand what biases the researcher was going into this particular research with. And then the researcher's role is definitely as an instrument. So again, they need to identify their biases and personal values and assumptions up front so the reader can understand what frame of reference they need to take in when reading this research method findings. And then the researcher can't be too close to the data or the participants because that could be harmful. So for example, like a teacher interviewing their own students, that could have some bias. The teacher may like certain students over others. This would probably not be a good situation for the researcher to have. And then the ninth characteristic is a complex account. So again, we're talking about needing multiple perspectives for the data. You need to identify all factors involved in a situation. So even if you're not necessarily researching all factors, you need to account for what could potentially be more variables within the research that could give other explanations and reasoning for why something's happening. And this is really about sketching the larger picture. So in the example, we're talking about you maybe need to include the time of day of classes or the day of the week of classes. Maybe the temperature of the room is a variable, and maybe, the different subjects, the different class structure, the gender of the teacher potentially. There's several variables that, any problem in life is very complex, and so you need to include as many as you can so that the reader of the research, even if you don't go into every detail about each of these different variables, can kind of have a larger picture and understand the complexity associated with this particular issue. Next, we're going to talk about the 4 types of data collection. So these are going to be observations, interviews, documents, and audiovisual, social media, and digital materials. Some examples of these types of data collection for observations. The examples could be, the researcher is the participant. So, maybe the researcher is participating in a certain subject and learning that subject along with the students to understand the different variables that come with being in that position. And maybe the other participants don't know that this person is the researching them, so they just think they're another student, and maybe they, talk about things about the class, etc., so that the researcher gets a little bit more of a in-depth personal view without having that researcher participant bias that can happen. And then maybe, the other students know that this person is researching. And then maybe the participant is the observer, or the researcher is observing without participating. So then the researcher could just be observing the other students. Some examples of interviews could be like face-to-face interviews, maybe telephone interviews. There could be focus groups. So then you have multiple participants talking to the researcher and sharing their opinions as a group. And then you could also have email interviews. So then you're not actually talking, you're just communicating through email. Some types of documents could be public or private documents, meaning like minutes of meetings or newspaper articles, different people's journals or diaries or letters that people have written back and forth. And then examples of like audiovisual, social media, and digital materials could be things like photographs, videotapes, art objects, and maybe like computer messages that have been sent. Now I want to move into talking about the different advantages and disadvantages of these types of data collection. So on the slide, I have the advantages, and then I'll kind of run through some of the disadvantages associated with each of these as I talk. So starting with observations, the advantages would be that you have firsthand experience with the participants as the researcher. So this is very valuable because you can see things that maybe they don't communicate or they don't write down. You can see facial expressions. You can see the way that people interact with each other. There can be a lot gleaned from being able to observe. And then it's also useful when you're exploring uncomfortable topics, because maybe someone doesn't necessarily want to talk about something or want to write about something, and then you can just simply observe it and take what you see from that experience. Some of the disadvantages, though, are that the privacy of the participants. So maybe they're not able to share everything as they're being observed because they feel a little uncomfortable potentially, or maybe the researcher doesn't have good observation skills, and then they miss things, or they're not privy to certain things that are going on because they're missing certain facial cues or body language or things like that. So those are some disadvantages that could come along with observations. When talking about interviews, some of the advantages would be that this is very useful when participants can't be directly observed for whatever reason, whatever situation. Then an interview can be very helpful. And participants can provide historical information during these interviews. So when you're observing someone, it's happening in the moment, you're in the present. Whereas when you're in an interview, you can get historical context as they're talking. And then you also have control as the researcher over the line of questioning that's being asked, which can be helpful if you're trying to dig into a certain topic. And you want to, stuff comes up and you want to expand on that, you have control over where that goes. Some of the disadvantages of interviews are that you're receiving indirect information. So, sometimes there can be potential for bias in the responses or inaccurate responses because maybe someone doesn't remember something accurately, and you have to, kind of either trust what they're saying or take it with a grain of salt and just compile everything that you can once you have enough data and enough interviews, because people are human and sometimes, they misremember things. Talking about documents. So the advantages of looking at documents are that it is an unobtrusive source of information. So it's very convenient for the researcher to get. And you can the documents are sometimes in the language and the words of the participant, so you can really understand how they are thinking as they're processing, as they're documenting, as they're writing down these thoughts or whatever you are reading. And it gives the participants, it means that the participants have chosen to give attention to this document, or it wouldn't be written. So for example, a journal or a diary entry, these are very personal, and that means that the participant put effort and thought into this entry, and you are getting their emotional and real time, or not real time, but like real life thoughts and emotions. It also saves the researcher time, as they don't have to go observe someone or interview someone. They can do this at their convenience. Some disadvantages for documents are that the possibility for authenticity or accuracy could have issues. So sometimes maybe documents aren't as authentic or accurate as, observing or interviewing someone could be. And they also require the researcher to look in hard to find places. Sometimes, I don't give my journal out, so I'm sure that, if you're looking for journal entries of somebody or of a particular group of people, that could be a little bit difficult to find. So it might require a little bit more effort in that area. And then sometimes documents may be incomplete, which could skew the way that the research is able to, or the data is able to be compiled. And then moving into the final type, which is audiovisual, social media, and digital materials. Some advantages are that this is also an unobtrusive data collection. The participants can share their reality directly, and typically, especially if we're talking about social media, this is very easy to get. Very, you can gain a lot of information from looking at people's social media, and it typically captures attention visually. The disadvantage to it is that sometimes it could be difficult to interpret. The next slide, we're going to be talking about the 7 steps of data analysis. So I'm going to go through each one and discuss a little bit about each. So starting with organizing and preparing the data for analysis. This step typically involves transcribing the interviews or optically scanning the documents, typing up field notes from the observations, or cataloging the visual material that you're gathering. You would then have to kind of sort it and arrange it into the different types, depending on where the source of information was from. And this is where you would start to kind of organize as best you can so that you can have your data properly done for analysis. The second step is reading through all of the data once it's kind of organized a little bit. So in this step, the researcher wants to find the general ideas for what the participants are saying. So as you're reading through all of the data, you want to look for the underlying tone of the ideas, maybe the impression of the overall depth, or the credibility and the use of information in the data that you have. And then once you've done that and you have a decent idea of what all of the data, says, or the information that you have, you want to begin coding the data. So this step involves taking the data that you have and segmenting them into categories, which are then labeled with a term. So coding is the process of organizing the data by bracketing chunks of the data, and then you can kind of like write a word that's representative of that category of data. This is very useful because you're gonna kind of take these codes that you gather and then transfer them into themes, which is the 4th step of the data analysis, and that's identifying the themes. So once you have a good amount of coding done, you're then going to take those coding categories and generate, typically they say about 5 to 7 themes per study. So the themes could be like a description of the setting or individual themes learned about the problem. And these themes are usually the headings like in the findings section of the study typically. So after you've identified a couple of themes, then you're going to develop a storyline interpretation. So this means that the researchers can go even a step further than the themes and develop a storyline based on the themes. And thus can be, for example, like a chronological development of the problem. So it can focus on a single group or a group of individuals. The sixth step is then further analyzing the data using an analytic framework. So you want to pick an analytic framework, typically narrative research, grounded theory, ethnography, or a case study could be used. And this will help you further analyze the data using the framework so that you can have a better picture of what your findings are. And then the last step of the data analysis is representing and interpreting the data. This means that, typically in qualitative research, there can be things like different visuals or models to represent the data. And so the most popular approach tends to be using a narrative passage to convey the findings of the analysis, which would be like a discussion section which details the interconnectedness of the themes and the chronological description of the events. Then you could have like different drawings or tables or figures that represent the data in a visual way so that the reader can kind of take that in a quicker way, so that you're able to see the data visually, and then you have your description and your interpretation section as well. So then I want to talk about the key components for interpreting your qualitative findings. And there's a list here that I'll talk about each one of these. So some of the components could be like pattern coding. We talked about this in the previous slide. That's when the researcher creates these codes and then separates them, or separates the data and then creates codes around that chunk of data so that you can then go into deeper analysis for each of those codes. And then as you do the inductive and deductive reasoning that we talked about previously, some of those codes may be discarded, some may be some new ones may come up, or some may be condensed. So this can be kind of an iterative process that happens throughout the data analysis and the interpretation. And then you want to have finding statements. So once the codes are created, you're then creating the themes that we talked about in the previous slide. And then once the themes are created, you can go deeper like we talked about and do finding statements. So this means that the researcher can take the themes and combine some to present the data in a more clear and actionable way. An example could be that, maybe a couple emergent themes are like real-time data analysis and data transparency. So maybe those are two themes. Then a finding statement example could be like data transparency supports real-time data analysis. That's an example of how to combine two themes into one finding statement. Another key component for interpretive qualitative findings is offering personal perspective. So I talked about this previously, where the researcher could interpret the data dependent on their, personal chosen methodology or personal bias. So the researcher needs to state this in their paper, that what their methodology is and what their potential biases are, so that the reader can be aware. Another key component is stating the lessons learned. This is very clear, like what was learned from the study. The interpretation may be within the lens of the researcher's personal bias. So this is a part that plays to the previous point, where the researcher needs to state their personal perspective, because that could influence the lessons that were learned from their perspective. And then comparing the findings with past literature and theory. This is where the researcher would talk about if the findings confirm or diverge from previous studies of similar data, similar research. And then raising questions is a key component. So you want to, as the researcher, understand if new questions need to be asked from the research, if there are things that were not researched but could be of interest, and you have questions from what you researched and what you gathered. The interesting thing about a qualitative study is that it can end with more questions. It doesn't have to end in a period. It can end in a question mark. Another key component is stating limitations. So this is where, the researcher wants to talk about if the methodology that they chose was limited, if there were roadblocks that were faced, and then if they could be avoided in the future, if those roadblocks could be avoided. This is important to state the limitations of the research and the methodology that was used so that studies in the future can kind of, if they can do better, if they can avoid certain roadblocks, that helps the research have life in the future. And then you want to talk about an advance and agenda for future research. So this is talking about where should the study go next. Just like the previous point, are there roadblocks that could be avoided? Is there a better methodology that could be used for this particular type of research? Is there a different direction that the next study should go? Just kind of giving different options and different ways that the next researchers and the next studies could be even better and give more data. And then finally, we're talking about how qualitative research components apply in marriage and family therapy. So the 4 types of components that I'll talk about are going to be observations or interviews, data collection, external validity, and the researcher's role. So starting with number 1, the observations or interviews, the application in marriage and family therapy could be examples like the client consultation, goal setting, or research exploration when you're meeting a new client or when you're even in session. So when you're meeting a new client, typically there is a process for like observing their behavior, interviewing them, asking them questions about their history, asking questions about why they want to be in therapy, where they want to go, what their goals are. This all falls into observations and interviews. And then as sessions go on, you are continually observing your clients. You're continually gaining information from the way they interact with each other. If you're counseling a family or multiple people, you're observing how they are reacting to different emotions, different triggers, the way that they speak about something. You're constantly observing as you're engaging in your counseling sessions. And then the second qualitative research component is data collection. So the application of marriage and family therapy here is going where the data takes you. You are definitely, relying on the data to develop the framework. So whatever your client or clients are telling you, that is unfolding in the process of where the session may go, where the entirety of the sessions goes, what you talk about. You really need to be able to listen to all parties involved and identify the client's process or patterns and then work with that. So it's not about what you want, it's really coming from the perspective of the client, which is a very big qualitative research component. Third is going to be the external validity. So this is interesting because you can use this, in the application of marriage and family therapy by understanding if findings from one case apply to another case. So you need to assess if, just like a qualitative researcher does, a qualitative researcher needs to assess if their findings from one study apply to another study or not, and therapists need to do that as well because, typically case to case is different. I mean, every human is different, but there can be findings that can be applied from one to the other. And then the fourth qualitative research component is the researcher's role. The therapist is very much the observer and the participant in these sessions. They guide the sessions, but they need to be able to be there with their clients. They need to be able to observe and participate and interview in order to help the research, help the session move where it needs to move. So they need to be able to, ask certain questions or reframe thoughts and kind of change perspectives if needed and help the client just yeah, guide them in the direction that they're wanting to go, that they're needing to go. So very much the therapist is a researcher in the marriage and family context. Is the end of my presentation. I hope that you enjoyed it. Here is a list of my 4 resources. Thank you very much for listening.